Welcome back to Smitty's Learning Room. Today we continue with the HSC option Sports Medicine, and we're going to have a look at the concept around climatic conditions. So having a look at the syllabus, we know that this is the last dot point for the focus question: what role do preventative actions play in enhancing the well-being of the athlete? So previous videos have had a look at physical preparation, sports policy and the sports environment. The previous video around environmental considerations looked at temperature regulation, including convection, radiation, conduction and evaporation. And today's video is going to have a closer look at climatic conditions, so things like temperature, humidity, wind, rain, altitude and pollution. And the video will also have a look at guidelines for fluid intake and acclimatization. So by the end of this video, we should have covered all of the dot points for the focus question: what role do preventative actions play in enhancing the well-being of the athlete? So again, to bring this all into one big picture, what are we looking at? We're looking at this concept of what role do preventative actions play in enhancing the well-being of the athlete. This video will continue to look at the environmental considerations that can enhance the well-being of the athlete. So as discussed in the previous video around environmental considerations, the environment in which an athlete trains and competes in can have a significant impact on their performance. And extreme temperatures, either high or low temperatures, can have significant physiological effects on the body. This is due to the body trying to control thermoregulation to maintain core body temperature. Now this video will have a look at how different environments and different temperatures can affect the athlete and what you can do to try and decrease the influences of these environmental considerations. So we start by having a look at the climatic conditions. Now, climatic conditions can be detrimental and also valuable when training and performing. So obviously if we have desirable climatic conditions, if an athlete is well suited to competing in hotter or cooler climates, that's obviously going to be valuable. However, most often extreme temperatures are usually detrimental, so they have a negative effect on training and performance. Now, when we look at climatic conditions, an increase or decrease in temperatures, so we're looking at sort of temperature extremes here, can increase the stress on the body. If we have an increased stress on the body, that means that we've got a decreased ability to function properly for performance. So we want to try and have that perfect level of stress, or that sort of optimum arousal, and external stresses need to be decreased as best as possible to try and increase the body's ability to perform. So we start by having a look at hot and humid climatic conditions. Now, humidity is the measurement of moisture within the air, and often when we have an increase of temperature, this can mean we have an increase of humidity. Now, it tends to be that areas or environments that are close to water or close to the coast have increased humidity because there's an increased amount of moisture in the air. So environments that are quite rural or even arid are going to have lower levels of humidity because the measure of the moisture in the air tends to be lower. Now, what does that mean for athletes if we have an increase in humidity? So an increase in humidity means that our capacity to evaporate or evaporation is decreased. And so therefore our body can't cool down efficiently by sweating. So if it's humid, what happens is we sweat and the sweat sort of gets trapped in the body, and we can't release that to try and cool the body down. Now, what happens is vasodilation of the red blood cells occurs to try and decrease the heat within the body. How vasodilation works is it increases the size of the blood cells to try and release heat from the blood cells and out of the body. Vasodilation allows the blood flow in the body to increase, thus releasing heat from the body. When athletes are exposed to hot and humid conditions, there's an increased chance of heat stroke and heat exhaustion. Now, we know that hyperthermia is related to an increase in hot temperatures or extreme heat temperatures, and we're going to have a decrease in performance around issues of hypothermia because our body can't function properly. So things athletes obviously need to consider when we're looking at hot and humid conditions is how do we deal with trying to juggle the level of heat that our body is exposed to, and how do we deal with the humidity that's within our environment. And this is when we start looking at things like different types of clothing, looking at policies around managing heat and the amount of time that athletes are exposed to the heat for, whether they're engaging in practices such as icing or cooling of the body to try and control their body temperature in hot and humid conditions. In complete opposite to hot and humid conditions, we have cold conditions. Now, obviously, if we have an increase of cold weather, such as wind, rain, or even snow, we're going to have a decrease in our core body temperature. Now, different to hot and humid conditions where we have vasodilation of our red blood cells, we actually then have vasoconstriction of our red blood cells. So this is where our red blood cells contract and essentially get smaller to try and decrease the blood flow, which then allows our body to sort of maintain the heat within our body, and to a certain extent can increase the heat that's being held within our body to try and maintain our core body temperature. Now, if we're exposed to cold conditions, we're going to have an increased chance of hypothermia, which, like hyperthermia, will obviously decrease performance. So if our body isn't warm enough and we're unable to function and carry out daily needs, then therefore we're obviously going to have a decrease in performance. If we have a decrease in blood flow, we've obviously got a decrease in the amount of oxygen going around our body. What do we need oxygen for? We need oxygen for energy, which is obviously going to contribute to our level of performance. And when we look at cold conditions, a little bit different to competing or training in the heat, in that sometimes we can't actually deal with cold conditions except completely remove ourselves from it. And this is where the layering of clothing is essential in cold temperatures to control that core body temperature. In extremes, you might find athletes consuming warm or hot drinks or food to try and warm their body up, but it's generally done with layering of clothing. The next concept we have a look at is altitude, and how does altitude actually affect our performance? And very simply put, the higher we go above sea level, the lower oxygen supply we're going to have. So a prime example of this is, think about people who climb Mount Everest. The higher they go, the less oxygen they have. That's why it's so hard to get to the top of Mount Everest. And you'll see that some people will take oxygen tanks with them to try and compensate for the lack of oxygen naturally in the air. Now, what happens at altitude is our body tries to increase the creation of red blood cells to allow for that increased demand for oxygen supply. And so therefore performance is decreased as an athlete cannot meet the oxygen demand. So if we throw ourselves straight into performance at an altitude which is a lot higher than what we're used to performing at, our body is unable to meet the oxygen supply because we can't readily produce enough red blood cells in that time. And so this is why we look at this concept of altitude training. And so if we increase our time spent at altitude and spent training at altitude, we increase our body's capacity to increase the oxygen intake at altitude, because over time our body gets used to using minimal oxygen, and it also develops more red blood cells within the body to obtain that oxygen. And this is where you'll see athletes might actually move to an area of high altitude, say months or weeks before performance, to help acclimatise. And we'll talk about acclimatisation a little bit later in the video. So the next thing that can impact an athlete's well-being and performance is air pollution. Now, air pollution can contribute to many injuries and illnesses. And when we talk about air pollution, this is generally like a smog or pollution within the air, and you'll usually find this around large cities. And so an increase in air pollution can cause many issues, specifically around things like asthma and other respiratory illnesses. So athletes who suffer from respiratory illnesses obviously need to take precautionary measures in relation to competing and performing and training in areas with high air pollution. Now, one of the main issues with in increased air pollution means that we have an increased difficulty to uptake oxygen. So again, we know that oxygen is vital for energy production and for performance. So if we have a decrease in oxygen, we have a decrease in energy production and obviously therefore a decrease in overall performance. Now, a great example of air pollution and athletes trying to deal with these issues is when the Olympics were in Beijing. A lot of athletes had to go to Beijing a lot earlier than when the Olympics started to try and acclimatise and try and get their bodies used to the air quality. Obviously, something else that athletes were faced with in Beijing was actually the humidity. So not only are they trying to make changes to their routines or make adaptations for their body for the air pollution, but also the heat and the humidity. So another concept that we can have a look at in relation to climatic conditions are guidelines for fluid intake. And obviously our level of fluids, or the amount of fluid that we intake, is going to be highly dependent on the type of environment or the climate which we're exposed to. So what happens is when we increase our exercise, we increase the fluid loss from sweating. So when we increase exercise, we sweat more to obviously maintain our core body temperature, which means we lose fluid. So therefore, somewhere along the lines, we have to replace those fluids so our body can continue to function at a normal level and our core temperature can stay at optimal temperature. Now, our body needs water to help us cool and control that core body temperature. So we obviously need to replace it when it's been used. And how do we determine this? Well, a lot of different athletes will have different amounts of fluid loss during performance. And obviously this will vary depending on what climatic conditions they're exposed to. But a general guide is that for every kilo that an athlete loses during exercise, they should replace 1 litre of water post-exercise. So, for example, an athlete who might be playing a full 80-minute game of football might weigh 70 kilos at the start of the game. When they weigh in at the completion of the game, they're at 68 kilos. That would mean that that athlete needs to consume 2 litres of fluids post their game to ensure that their body has replaced the fluids which have been lost, which means that they can recover properly and that their body is back to the regular core temperature. Obviously, sports that go for longer, athletes need to replace fluids throughout as they are used. So finally, we have a look at this concept of acclimatisation. Now, I've sort of brought this up a little bit when we were looking at hot, humid conditions, cold conditions, and also at altitude. Now, basically, acclimatisation means that we're allowing our body to adapt to the environment around us. So basically, an environment that we may not be used to. And acclimatisation training it's used to prepare us for an event or performance which is in a different climate to our usual training environment. So if I'm used to training in Sydney, where the temperatures are relatively sort of normal and stable in the summer, we don't have extreme heat in the summer, but then I might be heading over to Mexico to race in the middle of their summer, where it's quite humid and conditions are of extreme. I may have to go and spend several weeks in Mexico prior to my event to acclimatise my body to the heat and to the humidity. Now, usually it takes about 7 to 10 days to adapt to the environment that you're in. Obviously, the longer you are exposed to that environment, the better the adaptations that you can make, especially when you're looking at altitude training. Now, if you do expose yourself to that different environment 7 to 10 days prior to performance, obviously the adaptations that you make to these environments decrease the chance of hypo and hyperthermia. And adaptations in colder climates, we need to remember that equipment as well as training needs to be used as well. So, for example, warmer clothes. So it's not a case of let's say I was going over in Banff, Canada, to compete in the winter. I'm not going to go over there and wear the same clothes I'm going to wear in Sydney's summer. I need to actually take warmer clothes with me, which will help my body stay warm and keep my core temperature at optimum. So there's lots of things to think about with acclimatisation, but the key things are that you need to sort of be exposed to that that climate 7 to 10 days beforehand to see adaptations start to take place.